Right, whew. Tell you what, it's one of those days. I'm needing an extra shot.
Yeah.
An extra shot of Retropower coffee, which you can buy online in the shop.
Episode 128?
Yeah, episode 128 of Retropower Uncut. I better give this a quick stir. I mean, I may be in need of a wake up, but I'm not insane. I can't have an unmixed extra shot of espresso. Right, let's go. See what's been going on. I must admit, it does feel at the minute like, and it perfectly sums up that sort of saying about the last, I don't know, 5% being 90%, or whatever the saying is. And it's very true. When building cars, you get to that point where you think you're so close to the finish, and yet it still just seems to take forever. And we're kind of at that point with lots of things at the minute. So in the metalwork shop, it kind of feels like the Escorts is like, oh, come on, it's there, it's there, it's there. And we've kind of got the same thing here with these cars as well. So Morris, which pleasingly I've had a reasonable amount of time on this week. So we've been buttoning up quite a few things, and actually it's, I would say, pretty much ready to go testing in. If it wasn't for the fact that we've got about 3 inches of snow outside. So that's always the way, isn't it? As soon as all the cars are ready to be taken out on the road, the weather turns bad. So I have been buttoning up all sorts of little things. We did the fillet on the front windscreen. I fitted the rear view mirror camera. So for those who haven't heard me talk about this before, it's using a Gentex FDM full display mirror. So the rear view mirror is actually an LCD screen, and there's a little camera in the rear window. Big plus of that is you don't see any of the interior in your rear view mirror, so it's just a completely uninterrupted view of the road. Obviously automatic dipping, automatic brightness control according to the sunlight, etc. Really good bit of kit. And then one of the extra bits of functionality is the reverse camera. So a while ago on the back of there we made a billet piece which holds the number plate light, but it also mounts the reverse camera. And when you put it in reverse, it brings up a little inset second picture on the screen, which is from the second camera, which gives you the immediate view right up to the back of the car, whereas the rear view mirror is a bit more distant. So that's actually something I was testing again this week, because we fitted the boot lid for the final time, and that was waiting for the hinges. So we've machined our own billet hinges for the boot. James has now fitted those, fitted the latches. There's gas struts on those hinges, which I think are actually E30 BMW bonnet gas struts. And then they mount into the rear bulkhead on some machined clevises, and that was the sort of that was the stopping point in me being able to do a final fit on the interior, because we needed to put the bolts in those which go behind the bulkhead panel. So we've done that. I did a bit more electrical tweaking, one of the things being to test the electric boot release, which now works absolutely spot on. Our hope was that from the remote you could blip the remote and the boot would come open, which it does perfectly. James has just been working on some bump stops for it. We're putting some rubber buffers in and just trying to get the right softness so it doesn't stop too abruptly when it comes up. But it kind of ties in with one of my sort of bugbears about a lot of modern cars, is the sort of unnecessary complication to solve relatively simple problems, and electric opening boots is one of them. There's this trend at the moment for motorised boots that sort of slowly and frustratingly open electrically. Yes, they close electrically, which can be mildly convenient, although normally when you're closing your boot, by that time you don't have anything in your hand, so it's not really a hardship to close the boot. But also, if you've ever done that sort of camping trip where you're trying to get a sleeping bag in there and you're just trying to slam the boot on it to get it all in, electric boot lids don't like that. And in terms of the opening, you can achieve exactly the same thing with a spring or a gas strut. So that's exactly what we've done on this. There's an electric solenoid to release it, and then a gas strut that opens it up from there. So that's another thing ticked off. And with those struts bolted in, we could then get the rear bulkhead upholstery panels in for the final time. That then meant I could get the carpets in. I'd sort of laid them out loosely already, but they needed gluing in place, so I've been going through gluing all the different carpet sections in. That then meant I could get the seats in for the final time, so they're in there. And then I've been buttoning up a few other little bits and bobs. There's a very small fuse box, although the car generally is running a PDM system, which is like a programmable ECU to control all the electrics on the car. There's a little fuse block for things that have a continuous power. So we have the PDM go into sleep mode when the ignition's turned off. So it's not a parasitic drain on the battery. But we've got a continuous feed to the interior light circuit, the central locking circuit, the radio for the memory on it, which is just via a little fuse block. So I've been making a bracket for that. The same bracket has doubled up to hold a micro switch for the brake light switch on the brake pedal, which is one of the remaining jobs that needed ticking off. So I've got that lot finished up under there. And then the machined bezel for the radio, I've been meaning to get around to fitting that, which I've now done. That looks really neat now, it's all properly in place. It's kind of been hanging half in there for quite a while. And yeah, so it's basically buttoned up in there now. And then the other thing which I've been meaning to get around to for a while was fitting the grille. So today actually I've been just trial fitting that. In fact, I'll just sneak down here. I've been doing a trial fit of the grille. We had the surround made a while ago, which is just a water jet cut profile in aluminium, which we've had black anodized. And then we've got little bonded pads that have got studs welded to them on the corners, which go into some brackets that we put in the shell at the metalwork stage. And then I've just bonded in a sort of hex plastic mesh to it. And then I was able to fit the ducts in here, which you can hardly see actually now they're in, but we did 3D printed ducts that sit in here and make use of this space. And they're actually brake cooling ducts, so there's a round spigot on the back of those, with a duct that will go to the brake calipers. Got the spotlights in for the final time, so for the first time you're actually able to see the front end how we imagined it to be in its final guise, and I'm really happy with it. So I think I've just got to put up a couple of bits of wiring for the spotlights now they're in for the last time, stick the wipers on, and James, well at that point I can test drive it as soon as the weather's good. James is just working on the boot upholstery panels, and then they'll go away for upholstery, and that really is the last piece of the puzzle. And on the subject of upholstery actually, Dean was in today and dropped off various bits for the Land Cruiser. So we've got the door cards, the rear seat, which is like a double folding seat we've fabricated for the back, and the steering wheel, which has done a really nice job of leathering the original wheel. And I'm just trying to think what the other thing, oh, the dash. So we've used the original dash pad, but upholstered that in leather. So yeah, can't wait to get all that lot in now. I think also, possibly today, we'll have that inlet manifold back that you saw last week with those few tweaks, which I know have been done. So as soon as we got that back, that's then a cascade of jobs leading to the completion of that. Let me just squeeze by this way, and we'll have a look at these. So EType, I think last week you saw James doing all the CAD work on the interior changes, and now he's got all of that mocked up in there. So we've got a 3D print of the surround for the main Motec screen. He's got a 3D print of the sculpted piece that's going to be leathered around the Alpine screen that sits underneath it. So essentially everything's mocked up in there, and it looks really good, really happy with the look of that. Just getting to that point so we can then send away the billet piece around the screen to be machined, send the drawing away for it to be machined, and crack on with the next stages on that, which I think are the side panels on the centre console next. But that's looking fantastic. And then Adam's been on with some more plumbing work. He's run the front to back brake hose, he's run the front to back fuel lines on it, and he's just been chipping away at general assembly jobs really. He's got the rest of the throttle linkage put together on it now. He's been running the vacuum pipes, the remaining vacuum pipes, which run up to the bulkhead here. And I think we were just working out a position the other day for where the fuel pressure regulator is going to go, which is actually there's surprisingly few areas to choose from on that. But I think it's going to go sort of hiding over that side off the chassis tube, the diagonal chassis tube over there, so we can actually have the fuel lines come almost straight forward from where they are to there underneath, well under the throttle bodies. You'll be able to reach in next to the battery to adjust the pressure if you want to, but all the plumbing will be straight from the throttle bodies down underneath, so all the fuel plumbing will be totally hidden. So really on this we're just waiting for the gearbox, and then we can get engine and box in, and that opens up all of the next phases of work on it. So I think we're all very excited to see that happen on that. Bobby is moving forward with dry build work on this. So last week he was working on this scissor hinge arrangement. That's just a mock-up, but it's proof. It's basically proving out the dimensions of that scissor mechanism to make sure it gave us the required lift for the bonnet to clear the door. I explained about that last week. And then with that kind of done, the next step really was working out the bonnet latching system. That then tied into all of the front end componentry in the chassis here, which then in turn meant we needed to really get the engine and gearbox back in. So that's what we did, got the engine and box back in, which just looks incredibly at home. It's always surprising. Those engines in a lot of cars look absolutely massive, and in this, even though it's not a particularly big car, the engine bay is just so long that it looks absolutely tiny in there, really. So we're working out componentry layout. There's a lot to fit in this front part here, and we want to make it functional but attractive looking as well. So at the minute it's done a mock-up of the radiator. That's basically the biggest area we can get in there, 60mm thick core, which gives us a 70mm thick frame. We've spec'd what fans we're going to use. He's done just a cardboard mock-up of those on the back, the space the motors take up. Then on the front of the radiator we've got the aircon condenser, which pretty much takes up the whole area of that. And then on the front of that, which he's done another steel mock-up of that, will be the charge cooler radiator. If you haven't already noticed, this is a supercharged Chevy LSA. And the supercharger inlet essentially has a water-to-air heat exchanger built into it. So you then have a separately pumped water circuit to that, which then has a radiator at the front. So that's a mock-up of that radiator there. So we're basically laying out all the components that need to go in there. The next one is then the bonnet latches. So I think he's just in the process of a sort of rough mock-up of how the bonnet latch is going to sit over there. We're using BMW, I think they're 1 Series latches, and then these are from a different BMW. I actually can't remember off the top of my head what, but they have the safeties on here as well. I think that currently, as it stands, is the plan to use these because they're cable operated, and then the old pull-up handle that's inside here, which is quite a cool feature, is then going to operate those via cable. So you'll release the bonnet from inside, but then the safety will be the original handle. So we're trying to integrate those neatly into here. And then one of the biggies is the actual air intake, and getting a decent filter in there with a cold air feed. And our options are quite small. We can come over the top of here potentially and get a filter at the front, but there's not a lot of space unless you drop the radiator, and then you're compromising the radiator area, which we don't really want to do. It's a big, a lot of power, and generally speaking, modern engine efficiencies are pretty similar to one another, so really the ability to get heat out of the system is more or less proportional to how much power the engine makes. So we're going with having the filter behind, but because of where this is, I'm trying to get it all to look neat, and you've also got to have quite a long section, at least 9 inches straight, with the airflow meter in it. So I think our plan is to bring this over here, down and under and across, which will be where the airflow meter is, and then into the end of a box which sits on the back of here, which will have a cylindrical air filter in there to try and maximise the surface area within quite a small space. And then our plan with all of this is there's going to be a cover that sits over it, which I think will be a moulded carbon cover. That's still to be decided, but we're certainly thinking it would be nice to have one piece cover that goes over the whole of the front of this, possibly with some Zeus fasteners on it. And if that's the case, then there'll be a sort of central snorkel, if you like, off the middle of the top of the cover here, which will have a seal that mates up to the underneath of here, which is where there's a cold air intake there. And then hopefully the whole of that will look like one nice attractive carbon panel, just the slots in it for those to go through, a little snorkel that mates up with there with the filter inside it, and everything else looking super clean and minimal. That's why all the thoughts at this stage and the whole dry build process is worthwhile, to plan all of this stuff, plan where all the pipe work's going to go, plan all these details now, so it kind of looks like one cohesive design when we're done with it. So that's where we're at with that. I'll have a little wander this way if you do a reverse. Camaro, John's been on with largely the plumbing, coolant and refrigerant plumbing. So we're trying to do a really neat job of the way the plumbing comes through under the offside wing. We put threaded bosses down it at metalwork stage. We had holes in the bulkhead sort of under the inner wing for one of the four port vintage air bulkhead connectors to where the refrigerant and heater water all pass into the cabin. But we're trying to make it ridiculously neat under that inner wing, so we've actually decided to do the most of the run under there now in a fabricated aluminium hardline to keep the heated water pipes really tight against the inner wing, so we've got space to have the screen wash tank, which is going to be under that wing. So that now really happy with. He's run the refrigerant lines to there as well. We're just waiting on some clips to attach them to some tabs which are an integral welded part of the aluminium water lines as well. And then he's been mocking up the lines inside as well, ready to get those crimped. And then he's moved back on because we had a delivery from Summit Racing this week, which had a few of the bits we're waiting for on this. There's more deliveries to come, but the door latch, one of the door latches had a broken spring on it. So he decided to replace the whole latch. So he's now able to get the other door built up, get the latches into that. He's just been adjusting the strikers today. I think he's got both of the window lift mechanisms in there now. So it's just cracking away now at general assembly tasks. I can see at the minute they've got the rear glasses laid out over here, so they're going to start pulling those apart, refurbishing all the components on those in advance of the new glass set arriving, which should be pretty soon. And then in the meantime, actually, this has been going on for the last few weeks, but I don't think we really covered it. We've been designing the centre console. So in this, there's going to be a console that runs, doesn't touch the dash, but basically carries on the line of the central part of the dash and flows down. And that will have a machine, maybe 3D printed actually. It might be a 3D print because it's going to be a painted finish. Sort of panel on it with the gear stick coming through. It's got the two gauges in it, which are Classic Instruments gauges. One's a clock, one's a four-way instrument, so it's got 4 bits of information on it. And then there's the Audison ADC, I think it's called, little volume controller, which will control obviously the volume of the audio system in there. And that's the only thing audio-wise that's going to be visible on this. He's just got a place to put his phone, like Bluetooth to the Audison Bluetooth receiver, and then we've got that little volume control, and that's all he wanted, so you can do all the other stuff on his phone. And then actually tying in with that is the upper part of the console, which the guys have now prepped and painted. There was a lot of head scratching over what colour we were going to paint that console. We've settled on silver. When we originally did some renderings for this car, it was silver, but the outside of the car was going to be silver as well. And now it's this colour. We were sort of torn. We were thinking, well, we could do it the green, but don't know. It kind of looks it's a bit too try-hard having such a bold exterior colour on the interior as well. And then we were thinking, well, satin black kind of blends in too much with the rest of the dash, which is all satin black. And then we were thinking about doing, there's some bronze accents like the wheels. We're going to carry on some of those bronze accents elsewhere, and we thought, well, we could do it that bronze colour, but it would be nice if that was only small little accent details. So in a sort of massive about turn, we eventually came around to just doing it silver again, because there are silver details throughout, the bezels on the vents, etc. are silver. So it kind of made sense actually to go back to it being silver. So that central upper part, which we fabricated several years ago now when we were originally starting this project, which has been on and off a little bit over the years. So that's a fabricated piece that Stu made. It's got Audi A3 air vents in it, and then a little area for the Vintage Air AC controls to go. That's now been prepped and painted. Looks really smart, so I can't wait to see that all together actually with the console and all the rest of it. And I think on that note, I have already talked about Land Cruiser, so I'm going to hand over to Nat in the metal workshop. I shall see you next week. Mugs and coffee available in the shop. See ya. Well, hello folks, and welcome to the dark side. And here we are again for some more fabrication shop. And we are in a scene of absolute carnage at the moment because there is an awful lot of finishing off going on. We, having tried to neatly sequence cars to be finished in a nice even interval, we've actually got 2 cars pretty much being finished exactly in parallel, and they're both going to be battling for the trip through the blast room together, but we'll come to that in a minute. We'll start the week with behind out of camera because there's nothing really to show on it visually particularly. The Project Kuma Mark 1 Escort. Sam's done 1 or 2 little bits of fabrication on that. The inner wing top rails he's welded in there. The rear wing mount sections on the inner wings for that, and a few other little bits of fabrication, but that's been more in the background because most of the focus has been on the Project One Escort. But a little thing that we've had arrived this week from Concept Racing were the fuel tanks for the two cars. We've probably mentioned in a previous episode a few weeks back about drawing up the fuel tanks. I drew those up on CAD to fit in the space above the axle assemblies in both these cars. So these have turned up from Concept Racing, very nice, as you can see. I thought it's a good moment to give a little brief while we've got carnage going on in here and it's sort of not the most photogenic walk around this week. Might be a good opportunity to do a little bit of a sort of an how, why and what on a fuel tank design. So here's a box. It's basically a big box that holds fuel, really technical. But there's a few jobs it needs to do, one of which is prevent any fuel surge. Both these cars will be running fuel injection. You've got to make sure that at no point during any sort of type of driving with any level of fuel in the tank does the car suffer the fuel pump picking up air and trying to inject air through the injectors, which will cause the engine to misfire. That can be quite dangerous if it happens in the middle of a corner, which is usually when a fuel surge or fuel failure to supply to the pump problem might happen. So what we do is we add a box to the bottom of the tank. It's not the most technical thing. Basically, on the bottom of the fabrication, with the bottom fully welded into the tank, a box is welded over it, and then some holes drilled through into the main body of the tank, so that where the box is then filled through the holes in there, which acts as a baffle to prevent the fuel surging out. And then these two fittings on the bottom, there's an AN8 half-inch fitting that feeds the fuel pump, and then an AN6, which is the return from the fuel rail for the bleed off from the fuel pressure regulator that's fed back to this little box to try and keep the level as high as possible in this little surge tank, as we call it. So that prevents your fuel surge when the tank's running low, and during cornering the fuel might all surge to this end of the tank and be away from the pickups. That gives the additional capacity enough to make sure that the engine doesn't get starved of fuel. So that's the purpose of that little bit. On the top we've got various vent fittings. They all again have their own little purpose. These two are the AN8 fittings, half-inch bore fittings fitted to either side of the tank there. They'll be teed together, and then the branch from the T will come up, and then the fuel filler net comes off here and goes up to the standard fuel filler position on the quarter panel of the car. That will have another AN8 fitting welded into it, might actually be brazed into that, but near the top, actually welded, possibly, I think that will be done in stainless steel, so it probably will be welded in. Near the top of that, where the fuel filler would go in, where your fuel filler nozzle would go into the fuel filler pipe, and that will vent between the fuel filler pipe and the top of the tank during fuel fill, so that as the fuel fills the tank and displaces the air, it displaces it up these quite large diameter pipes and pushes it out of the fuel filler neck during the filling operation. So that's what those are for. And then these smaller connections, which are AN3 3/8 fittings, well, 3/16 bore. Two of those, they'll be teed together, and then they'll be then piped out through the boot floor of the car down under this section here. They'll be piped out, and they actually vent the tank to atmosphere, so that during driving, while the fuel is being used in the tank, it doesn't generate a vacuum in here. So the fuel filler cap won't need to be vented. The ventilation for the tank is done through these AN3 lines that ventilate out through the bottom of the boot floor, and that means so that as the fuel is used, air can come in to fill the space vacated by the fuel. That's what those are for. And then the last fitting on the tank is this disc on top, which is a mounting ring for a VDO type fuel level sender, which is the tube type, the dip tube. It has a float within an aluminium tube, which then goes down. The fuel tank is foam filled, and the tube for that level sender goes down through a hole in the foam, and that means that because it's within the tube, the fuel tank foam can't interfere with the float, so that you don't get problems with the level sending. And then obviously lastly, these brackets on here, which are for the trim panel that's going to cover all this lot up. In the back of the car, there'll be a trim panel over there. That's going to fit. There'll be M5 riv nuts put into these little brackets on here. And then the trim panel that goes over there. There'll probably be some spacers, I think, actually as well. And then the panel that covers that area will be screwed onto those, cover up that part at the front of the boot. So that's the anatomy of the fuel tank, which is turned up.
bit of a hell breath while I tried it in the car, but it does fit, so that's good. That'll all be mounted in with 2 straps and sitting on foam on top of the axle assembly and on the rear bulkhead. And that'll help deaden the sound at the rear bulkhead as well. There'll be somewhere in the region of 10-12 millimeters of neoprene foam stuck to the rear, the boot side of the rear bulkhead, and then the tank will be clamped into that foam. So it should provide a really nice sound deadening to the rear bulkhead area. So that's hopefully all going to be a plan that comes together. So we've got 2 of those. That's just one of them I just brought down just to give you a quick show around it. And then moving on from that, as I say, there's not a lot else to show there. We'll quickly skip over here because the front's sort of loosely thrown together again. We're having another go round with the panels on this. Every time we go around, there's something else to have a quick look at, and there's another little niggle to fiddle around with, and we're just doing that ever turning wheel of revisiting little niggly problems. We're pretty much at the end of that now. We were hoping to have the car in for blasting by now, and that's not happened. I think it will be ready by tomorrow, but with everything else going on, I think it'll be Monday. Today's Thursday. I think it'll be Monday morning when we actually set to on blasting and zinc metal spraying these. By the time we've got it finally stripped down again, after having done a bit more dummy build-up, we're just checking fit. We had a couple of areas we knew we needed to check fit things, like the rear window aperture needed a tweak. We needed some tweaks on the front wing fit as well, which we've done. But we've just revisited a few areas where we wanted to double check things, found a few more niggles as you always do, and then some of the things that we were quite happy with, now we've revisited them, don't look quite so great, and we've had to do various tweaks again. So yeah, just going round and round that roundabout really, with that couple little bits of lead work as well to improve things. Interestingly and quite amusingly, a little bit earlier today I was contacted by a guy who runs a very nice panel workshop up Liverpool way, who I sort of know through social media, contacted me because he's working on a Mark 1 Escort and has come to fit new doors to it, same as we did on this car, and was pondering why the doors are about 9mm out of line with where they should be. And it was a very easy question to answer because we've experienced this with this, is that the hinges are welded on the doors in the wrong place. So that was an easy one to answer, but it's interesting, it's quite comforting to talk to somebody else having exactly the same problems with exactly the same panels. So there we go. So that's where we're at on that. Jamie's about to tell me something. Yes, well done. Jarkle's just reminded me about a bit I'd forgotten. She's on the doors. We made a little boo-boo. We bought new doors for this car, and I'd totally forgotten that with the combination of the various parts that we're using for the door locks, which is slightly complicated, but we do want the little pin pulls for the door lock releases on this car. The early cars didn't have those. We're using early doors because we're using the early type door handles. However, we're using the later type latches, and we want to use the door pin pulls. And on the other car, that problem was solved because we've used early type door skins but fitted to late type door frames. On this car, it's slightly complicated because we actually used early type complete doors. If we rewind, you'll probably remember that we actually re-skinned the new doors. Such was the poor state of the skins on the new doors. We actually had to re-skin the brand new doors. But anyway, that was an early type skin on an early type door, and it had gone unnoticed by me until Mark pointed it out that we didn't have the pin recesses for the door lock releases in those doors, and we did in the other car. So we've actually transplanted those. Scott's transplanted that section of the door frame from the old doors for this car, which we'd kept, into the new door inners, so that we do have those little spaces for the little plungers now. So he's done a nice job in letting those sections into the doors, so we do have the spot for the plungers now. That would have been a bit of a boo-boo if that one had been missed, and I just hadn't picked it up. So many little things at this sort of stage on a build, with so much going on, it's very, very hard to remember everything, and that's one of those things that had slipped the net. So well done, Mark, for pointing it out. On to the Redux M3. This is on the very final stages of just little bits of seam brazing. There was a few little locations for parts that were being added, which we mentioned last week. They've just been finished off. Scott's literally just going around, and Sam are just going around weld dressing off any last little bits of weld, finishing the last bits of seam brazing. But probably within the hour, this will be coming off the rotisserie onto a trolley, out of this bay, out of the way, then we can get the jig lift in, take that Escort off the jig, get that on a trolley, get that out of the way. Then we'll park the spare jig back in that bay. That Escort will be, as I say, is pretty close to being able to go in for blasting. This will be going into the blast room and getting set up for blasting and zinc metal spraying. And then immediately that's done, Project One Escort will be going in for blasting and zinc metal spraying. Project Kuma, the number 2 Mark 1 Escort, will be going over onto the 2-post lift in the first fabrication bay to have the underside fabrication done and the dry build work done. So the engine and gearbox will be going into that car that was fitted to that one. And we'll be building the transmission cross member in that one, putting the radiator, doing putting all the suspension parts into it, doing all the dry build work. And then in parallel with that, Tom is going to be carrying on with making the wheel arches for that car, which he's sort of started hammer forming, but not too far through. He's going to be cracking on with getting the wheel arches made so we can graft them into that. So all going on. I kind of hoped we'd have that move round done for this video, but it's not quite. If we could have left the video a few more hours, we'd have done it, but then Jamie would have run out of editing time. So we'll pick that one up next week, and it'll all be moved round in here then. And there'll be a new project to look at. So that'll be very exciting because it's. I'm really looking forward to it, and I'm in the background just starting to put a few of the bits together on CAD and in terms of parts and ideas in my head and things that need to be dealt with in terms of that are going on in the background, so that we've got a few ducks in a row ready for starting the next project in here. Then moving on to Churchill Jug. Stu's actually off poorly. Stu's not been very well. He's had a bit of a cold and it's gone to his chest a bit and he's not feeling too great. So he's not here today, and he came in yesterday but then went home. So his progress has been a little bit limited on this week. As I say, he's struggling a bit. He's made a dummy radiator for this one. We've kind of decided on the location for the radiator, decided what was going on, worked out a size that we can cope with in terms of the radiator. So he's made a little steel dummy rad, which we do pretty regularly for cars where we're not 100% sure on the radiator design before we start. So he's done that. He's then been working on oil cooler location and positioning, and air conditioning condenser location and positioning, which is really tricky. It always is in the front of a Mark II Jug because there's naff all space for anything because there's just so small an opening. We've obviously created an extra air intake underneath in the front, which gains us a little bit, but that very quickly fills with things we need to cool down again. We've got to get an hang on, I've got to get this right. The transmission oil cooler was going to go in the lower air intake area, and then the air conditioning condenser on the front of the main radiator, and then the electric fan on the back of the main radiator. We think we can still all get that lot in. The battle we've got at the moment is with the condenser fittings being in not a very handy place in terms of being able to get the elbows off them and get them through the metalwork in any respectable fashion. We've got a bit of a plan to create a box into this pocket that Stu's created inside the nose to get the fittings in, but we still can't quite get them in. So that's what Stu's in the process of, is designing and working out the mountings for all those parts, which is a real juggling act. However, as I say, at the moment he's not here, so that's kind of that's where it's at. But there'll be a few more hours of just head scratching and working out, juggling space. We're talking about 10 mil in total depth of space that we've got to work with to get all of those components in between the front pulleys on the engine and the forwardmost space that we've got in the front to actually fit the components of the width that will actually fit in that gap. So we're juggling things which are quite difficult to juggle there. Second to on this car, going on in the background, ignore the sort of pile of parts on the floor because some of those have been moved upstairs, is that George has now started in earnest on the CAD work for the front suspension on this. With a little bit of guidance, he's been drawing up the main wishbone positions. We've been measuring up the details on the boards for the bushes in the arms, because I think the plan currently, as it currently stands, is that we're going to fabricate we're actually going to machine new upper wishbones. We're going to use the X300 main lower arms, and we're going to use the X300 upright assemblies, ball joints, brakes, discs, bearings, everything there. But we're going to make slightly shorter upper wishbones. So we'll get a little bit more camber change, a little bit more camber gain in bump, than original. That's not a problem. If anything, that's probably a positive, because there was almost no camber gaining bump on the standard Jaguar setup. A little bit more camber gaining bump will do no harm at all. So we're going to be shortening the upper arms, I think, by about 15 millimeters as it stands. But again, George has got all the scan data, so where he's building the CAD model, he can refer to the scan data to make sure that the upper bushes and the upper arm pivot pins are all going to clear the inner wings on this. We've got to make a slight modification on one side to the inner wing, where there's just a bulge there that's in our way that isn't really doing anything. So we've got to alter that slightly. But at that point, we think we can get everything in. And I've also now got a steering rack that is short enough, I think, to work with our narrowed X300 setup, where I needed a steering rack of the order of sort of 545 millimeters across the inner ball joints, which I've managed to get now. A power steering left-hand drive rack with about 545 mil across the inner balls, which is quite tricky, but I found one. Unlikely source, I'll reveal that later when I know it works. But yeah, we've got that, so hopefully we've got all the building blocks in place. As I say, George is now drawing all those parts up in CAD so that we can do a bit of mock-up, make sure it's all going to work, make sure everything's as it is, check the geometry is all good. If it all works, it's all good, and we can fit everything in the space, then we'll get that fabricated and we'll have the front suspension finished. It's been a bit of a palaver, but we get in there. When is it not? And I think that pretty much sums up where we're at this week. As I say, next week, all changed, things will have moved. Those two cars won't be in the places they're in. There'll be something out, there'll be another Escort, the other Escort sat there, and possibly by the time we do the video, maybe not, but possibly by the time we do the video, there may be a new car or two in here. We'll see. Watch this space.